There tends to be a lot of movement within Christianity, going from one denomination or tradition to another, and it tends to be more than just one jump for one person in a life. It tends to be, I'm seeing a trend of it going just jumping from denomination and tradition to denomination and tradition to another one, about 4 or 5 times. In fact, I know someone who, within the span of, I want to say anywhere between 3 and 5 years. It's not definitely not more than 5 years, and it was I think about 3 years or so, but maybe even less. But just comfortable estimation there. Went from something like Reformed Baptist or Baptist of some sort to Lutheran to Anglican to Roman Catholic and then to SSPX um, within 3 to 5 years. And that is not a healthy way to have spiritual guidance, spiritual discernment. That doesn't help your spiritual your life in any way, honestly. And so what I want to do, why I'm making this video, is I want to give some tips, advice, some questions you can ask yourself about why I am leaving this particular tradition and going to another one. Now, I'm going to say tradition. I could be meaning denomination specifically with that as well, but just to give a sort of distinction, a tradition is going to be a wider net than a denomination. A denomination will be a tradition, for instance, will be the Anglican tradition. Within Anglicanism, there in the U.S., there are going to be various denominations. So you've got the REC and the ACNA, which are two different denominations, but are in fellowship with each other. Although sort of the REC is kind of under the umbrella, I guess you could say, of the ACNA, but we still have our own sort of canon law and all that sort of stuff. But I think the more important part that this will be attributable to is the question of the tradition that you're going to, because the most common one, like I think I said before, is that it's going from evangelical, it tends to be, to liturgical sacramental. And I don't want to make sort of critiques of any sort of tradition. Obviously, I am sacramental and liturgical, and I wouldn't say I'm very evangelical. In the best sense, I would say I'm evangelical, but not as it's understood today. But my point is not to critique these. It's just to say whatever you're doing, even if you're going from sacramental, liturgical to evangelical, I want you to listen to this video and watch this video. Because I want you to sort of think through that process of going to another tradition. So first I'll ask a few questions, and I want these questions to be questions that you ask yourself, all right? First question is, have I studied the issues, the critiques, the defenses, the history of both the tradition I'm leaving or looking at leaving and the tradition I'm looking at going to? So if I'm saying I need to leave evangelicalism and go to a liturgical sacramental tradition, my question to myself should be why? Why am I doing this? Am I doing it just because I like liturgy and smells and bells and all that sort of stuff? Well, if that's the case, then what's going to happen is you're going to keep a lot of your dogma, your theology within evangelicalism. And evangelicalism and sacramental liturgical traditions, they have some crossover, obviously, because I mean they're both Christian, obviously, but there's going to be major distinction between the two on theological questions. Sacramental theology, and evangelical is not going to hold to sacramental theology by and far. Maybe 1% of people will, and they're really the odd duck out, and it's kind of against much of the whole evangelical realm. That impacts things. So it is actually important to receive communion. You can't just go to a Zoom meeting of the church. You actually have to physically be there to physically receive the body and blood of Christ. That's going to be a major mindset. So just sort of the question of, well, why can't we just have Zoom church all the time? And not to get into debates about coronavirus and all that right now. I'm talking about things that I was experiencing when I was evangelical before I became Anglican and when I was going into Anglicanism, I had a roommate who would just go watch live stream of church, and that was his church, and that was perfectly fine with him because of his particular brand of evangelicalism. Now, that is not to say that evangelicals are, have no defenses against that sort of theology. They like there are people who would vehemently oppose that, obviously, and I would say the vast majority of evangelical theologians would oppose that for a variety of reasons, and they would have very good reasons. But that is something that is an example of something that might be carried in, because of the theology within the two camps. So you need to understand the differences of theology. You need to understand the history, how both groups developed. So this cannot be, if you're noticing, I'm having you do a lot of academic stuff, looking at the theology, looking at the history of both sets. And the reason is that you should not have a switch from one tradition to another as something that is on a whim. It should be something that is thoroughly studied. So you study the history of your particular brand of evangelicalism. You study the history of the particular brand of the liturgical sacramental tradition. That is not just looking at the pros from people who are sympathetic to those traditions, or I'm leaving this one, so I want to read the bad stuff against this one, and I'm reading this one because I want to go to this one and it's good, so I'm going to read only the good stuff. You should be reading the critiques of both sides and the defenses of both sides, both historically, theologically, etc. You should be seeing those critiques. Now, you also need to narrow it down into the denominations as well. But we're also looking at the greater tradition, obviously. But you should also be looking at what particular denomination you'll be getting into, because even within that tradition, there are going to be differences within the denominations. You should be seeing if there is a parish nearby where you'll be able to worship at, and if that is a leader, a spiritual leader, the pastor, priest, minister, whoever, elder, if that is someone that you are willing to submit to. Submission is incredibly important, and I'll be getting on that in a second. Are you willing to submit to this actual pastor, minister, priest, whoever? So with all of that being said, we then have to look at some other questions. All right, do I have dogmatic reasons for leaving? And it's connected with what we're talking about already. Have I studied the issues and all this sort of stuff? But do I have dogmatic reasons for leaving? Can I still be faithful in the tradition that I am at? So if I am a Baptist, an evangelical Baptist, and I'm looking at Anglicanism, and I'm like, I like the smells and bells and all that sort of stuff. But, I'm not convinced of infant baptism, if I say that. And I'm not convinced of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and I'm not, or any sort of sacramental theology. I just like the smells and bells. Well, the question is, am I just going over because of, of the ascetics? Can I do that within my own tradition? There are actual liturgical Baptists, believe it or not. Timothy George at it's in Alabama. I want to say Huntsville, Alabama. There's a seminary, and I cannot remember the name of it right now. But Timothy George is a theologian, quite liturgical, very influenced by Anglicanism, but he's still a faithful Baptist. And he sees himself as like, I tend towards the liturgical and even I think the sacramental. But he's opposed to infant baptism. And as Anglicans, we have to be okay with infant baptism. That doesn't mean that you necessarily need to baptize your infants, although it'd be really weird to not baptize your infants. So like these are questions you have to go through. Can I remain faithful as a Christian to what I believe to be true within the tradition I already am in? If the case is that you can be, and you're not causing disruptions or causing contention within that fold, stay within that denomination or that greater tradition, unless you have a reason to be so convinced that you're so convinced that you need to leave it. So with the Baptist example, if I'm convinced that, okay, babies can and should be baptized, I should not be trying to stay within that Baptist tradition and being like a contrarian where everyone's going this way and I'm going this way against the flow, saying, nope, we got to baptize babies. And, we're Baptists. Well, yeah, that's okay. But, that sort of thing. No. If you are not convinced that infant baptism is wrong, if you're convinced that infant baptism is a good thing, then you need to leave the Baptist denomination because you're going to cause contention. And if you're just going to be silent about it, that's not good either. So if you can be faithful as a Christian and you're not pricking your heart or you're not being contentious within that tradition, you should stay within that tradition, I think, unless you believe that major points of dogma are being ignored or rejected or added on to. So after that, seeing the reasons that you're leaving, you should ask yourself also, and this one is more of just a reflection for the process itself, but am I leaving because of anger or pride? Did someone hurt me, a pastor or a priest or someone? And I'm saying, and I'm giving reasons for going from one tradition to another, and dogmatic reasons maybe, but deep down inside, it's actually probably some sin of anger or pride or something like that, maybe shame that I'm leaving this tradition and going to another. Now, that's not a reason to not leave one tradition for another if you have good reasons to do it. But you need to make sure that your heart is in check for that. You need to make sure that when you're going from that tradition to another, you're not carrying bitterness. You're not carrying worry or mistrust or pride or anger of any sort, of any unrighteous sort. So have your heart checked. Go talk with your spiritual guides, whoever your spiritual leaders are, and see if those issues are indwelt within. Let's see what other ones we have. Can I be faithful, or do I have documented reasons for leaving? All right. So, will I grow spiritually in this move? That is another important question. Now, you might realize, okay, I really do have to leave this tradition right here, and I need to go to this. I need to leave this tradition. So then the question is, okay, if I go to this other tradition, do I know that I'll be spiritually growing? And do I have every reason to believe that I'll be growing spiritually? It might be, theologically more orthodox, and I'm realizing that this is true. But is there a good minister there nearby? Am I going to be spiritually fed? Am I going to have that fellowship with the believers that I can have? Also, and this is something I did, and I regret it, but when I left the Baptist tradition, I grew up Baptist, and actually I grew up fundamentalist, and became, after a few years, I became more convinced of sacramental and liturgical theology, and I almost became Eastern Orthodox, but I still had some reasons to not, dogmatic reasons. And I instead became Anglican because I found that I agreed far more with the Anglicans than I agreed with the Eastern Orthodox. But what happened was I had a sense of pride of like, ooh, I found the truth. And I mean, to this day, I think I still struggle with it every now and then or whatever. But, it's something that I'm fighting against. But, I've discovered the truth of, the sacraments, that no, baptism actually does save. This is the body and blood of Christ. It actually really truly is the body and blood of Christ. Liturgy is about worshiping God, not worshiping ourselves, those sorts of things. And those are true claims, definitely. And I think we should talk about those things. And I think we should talk about the problems with, various other things opposed to those positions. However, again, it's that heart question. How am I going about talking about these things? Am I throwing it in people's faces? Am I mocking them and saying, "Oh, you just believe in your old, whatever traditions and all that sort of stuff. You're not actually reading the Bible for what it says." All that sort of thing. That's an important thing that happens because that we need to address because it happens with a lot of people, myself included. I know plenty of people who have been like that. It's sort of about a decade or so ago, there was this common phrase about sort of, quote, cage stage Calvinism. Now, people are not becoming, quote, Calvinist anymore, although what they were becoming was not quite Calvinism, and that's a rabbit trail. Anyway, they weren't becoming that sort of Piper-esque Calvinist anymore, or they're not doing that anymore. But when they were, it was sort of, quote, that cage stage where it's like, oh, the doctrines of grace, I gotta tell everybody about it, and oh, you don't know, you're wrong. I mean, this happens today with some quote, cage stagers, where yesterday I was told because of my position on what was it? Uh, I don't believe in sort of quote once saved always saved, or well they wouldn't say it that way, but it's basically once saved always saved the way this guy was espousing it. And I was just told that I reject Christ and I am not a Christian because I believe that one can walk away from the faith. I believe in apostasy, that it's a real thing. So and that's obviously on social media, and tempers flare on social media. So be careful with social media too. That's another side note there. And you really, really need to study. I cannot overemphasize it. You need to be looking at books, reading, not people like me, not just people like me. I mean, I'm sort of an intro to help you guys out. I want you to look at books that deal with these issues from academics, from theologians, from people who are top notch. I'm just sort of the doorway saying, hey, here's some books. I want you to go beyond that. Don't just watch some YouTuber. I mean, I'm not popular here. I've got like what 300 people or whatever subscribers. Anyway, but hey, thanks for watching. Um, but yeah, no, you need to do more than just go. Don't be an online theologian where your entire study of the faith comes from YouTube videos and podcasts, and you don't ever crack open a book. You need to read some books. You need to read the church fathers. You need to read theologians. I mean, E.B. Pusey is a great one. Edward Pusey is one of my favorite theologians within Anglicanism, 19th century, part of the Oxford movement. He's much, much better than Newman. I'm not a big fan of Newman. Um, anyway, so these are some of the just sort of questions you should be asking yourself, a bit of advice. Take time, talk with your spiritual advisors about this. Don't hide it. Don't hide it from people, and just sort of have it as an internal thing. And you really need to see your reasons for going from one tradition to another. I hope this video is helpful. Please, quote, like, subscribe, and do all that fun stuff. And I hope the rest of your day is amazing.